What's going on, boys? Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Bones and Stones. I'm sure you can hear Tim's children screaming in the background. Anyways, today we've got George Michael Leader with us, all the way from the US. So, Mike, thanks very much for your time today. Thanks for joining us. Mike is an assistant professor at the College of New Jersey, and we thought we'd bring Mike on today to discuss some historical archaeology issues. Mike's been working with two specific sites. And we've been chatting for the last few minutes about your kind of experiences in dealing with these archaeological sites. And yeah, it'd be great to obviously hear about how you got involved with the projects and stuff. And you also mentioned that students have been getting involved with the excavations as well. So if you could maybe just take us through the different projects you've been working on.
Sure will. I'm going to have to clear up for any of my students or American colleagues that call me George, that I've known these guys for many years, and they have taken to calling me by my middle name, Mike. So yeah, which is great. But yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's nice to see you. So obviously, I know you two through our shared work in Southern Africa, working on the Stone Age, or Tim in your later Stone Age. But since moving back to the States, in addition to my ongoing work in South Africa, I've been involved in a few historic projects here in the States. And, as you get into anything in kind of modern colonial periods, you really take on a new role as an archaeologist. Archaeology changes, and it becomes a little bit of archival research, a little bit of historical research, and things that we don't face in the earlier Stone Age are issues that we have to deal with in historical archaeology. So two of the projects that I work on, one is called the Arch Street Project, which was named for the street that it ran on in downtown Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the oldest part of Philadelphia, which is one of the oldest and really most important historical cities in U.S. history. Some remains from the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia's burial ground, which was active from 1702 to 1859, were rediscovered accidentally by developers in 2016 and 2017. At that point, before the media was aware that these were rediscovered, the developers were using large excavating equipment to remove human skeletal remains, and these were actually being taken to a landfill outside of the city. When we found out about it, we were tipped off, and archaeologists were able to get in there. We were able to then save about 500 sets of skeletal remains for study, and eventually we're going to rebury every single skeleton, every single artifact. Everything is going back in the ground, because this is one of these projects where, as far as I'm concerned, this should have never been a site. This should have been a group, a population that was left in place. They should have never been disturbed. Unfortunately, that's not the reality of developing a modern city on top of a historic city, and that happens all around the world all the time. So secondly, another project I work on is on the campus of the College of New Jersey, and it's called the William Green House. That project has received a lot of attention recently. Basically what it is a house which was on a plantation that was built, the original house was built in about 1720 by the Green family. And branches of that Green family in New Jersey then spread out into the entire area. Some of those branches of the family were indeed had properties where they had enslaved people living and working. Now, what we have on the property that is the house that is now on the campus of New Jersey is evidence that that house had indentured servants working on it, which is a important but slightly different distinction between the groups. We've been running archaeology excavations there for about 5 years. Not every year. I think we've done about 3 or so excavations there to increase our sample of early colonial life artifacts. But recently, students kind of heard about this house thinking that there were enslaved people there and immediately called for kind of a reinvestigation and a rethinking of what this house means. And I think that's really the important part. What this house represents to particularly Black Americans that may feel that this house represents a very, very painful part of history. And how can we reclaim this space as an opportunity to educate, an opportunity to teach about this history that has, quite frankly, been so often silenced in history, right? So often history books are written by educated, wealthy, white males, and many of the marginalized people have just been completely excluded from that, sharing their contributions to early economies. And I think this represents an opportunity to do just that, to share these experiences and to learn about kind of these silenced pieces of American history and everyone's history. So those the two projects I work on in the States. But of course, as you two know, this doesn't just happen to more modern projects. This goes all the way back, as we see at sites like Canteen Copy, where we have some people want to mine away this heritage for perhaps if there are small amounts of diamonds somewhere in those alluvial gravels. The protection of heritage is, it feels like sometimes it's a tough sell for us, right? When we're talking about economics and we're talking about diamonds and we're talking about what a building represents. But I think ultimately there's a commonality that we can see in preserving this heritage and using it as a teaching tool for generations to come. And I actually agree with that.
I was going to say, Mike, thanks for that. It's incredibly interesting. Sorry, that was just my alarm reminding me that our meeting was meant to start now. So I'm glad we're on time, ahead of schedule. Mike, just two things before I get to Tim. Tim's got a question for you. But what baffles me is still, you mentioned that those graves were discovered in 2016, 2017. It's incredible that such a discovery can happen so late in time, given that all of the legislation is in place. I imagine obviously there's very strict heritage legislation as there is here, as there would be in the States. So for something like that to happen there at this point in time is quite incredible. And then just more so the observation, something that you touched on about where archaeology can then play a major role in education. And I think you definitely hit the nail on the head there, where it's so important, where in these instances, archaeologists are in a prime position when dealing with historical sites to help educate the public, about heritage and making it relevant to them as well. So thanks very much. It's incredibly interesting. But I'm going to hand over to Tim quickly for a question.
Yeah, Mike, I know not of this George character. I have a question just about the graves. Were the graves marked in any way? Do you know who the individuals are? Is there any details about the life histories of these people?
Yeah, so when we first discovered this, we immediately went into old maps of Philadelphia, and we were able to lay the modern map against the historic map, and it very clearly lined up with a burial ground from this First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. And we found out that it was moved, the burial ground was moved in 1859. What was moved were the headstones. All of the headstones were moved, and perhaps maybe even some, but definitely the majority of the burials were left in place. Okay. So we went to historical documents, and we went to the First Baptist Central Archives down in Atlanta and found burial records for about 3,000 people in this burial ground. So we have all these names, but we can't link those to the individual people, right? Because we do not have the headstones.
Okay.
Out of 500 remains that we were able to save, we have about 4 or 5 names, and that comes from a few coffin plaques that we can still read. And then I think there's one headstone that had been toppled over and buried, and it was still over one of the grave shafts with, I think, a stacked grave of 3 people. But it was like a 27-year-old male, and only one of those individuals fits that description. So we're doing full biological profile, age, sex, stature, trauma, nutrition, disease. We're doing calculus studies for paleopathogens. We're going to do isotopic studies. We've got colleagues. I mean, this has turned into an international collaboration with about a dozen different institutions between England and Canada and the United States and even other places. So we're doing everything we can to get an idea of who these people were. But it does at this point look like it was a mixed ancestry burial ground, which is very interesting for that time period in American history.
That's incredible. It sounds like such a. Sorry, Tim. Did you have a follow-up question? Okay. No, Mark. I was going to say it sounds like just from a research point of view, it's amazing that you're putting together such a great project there. But just getting back to the graves, in terms of ancestors of the people who were buried, are there any families that have come and laid claim? Are there talks of repatriation, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, in the whole question of historic preservation, I'm going to answer it too. You mentioned earlier legislation and protection and how this happens in 2016 and 2017. What we discovered are there's so many loopholes in legislation that allow this to happen, like private land versus public land, private funding versus public funding, and in ways that this can still actually happen. And one of the things that we've subsequently done after that is pressed Philadelphia and Pennsylvania into kind of trying to close some of these loopholes. So we're working really hard on that, and we've spent many hours in court actually arguing who should have control of these remains. That brings me to the second part, which is families and repatriation. It's tough because we don't have a single descendant group. What we used at first was the modern First Baptist Church, and there were many splits over the past 300 years in the Baptist Church, in this Baptist Church, and we used the modern group as our descendant community. And we actually have had a few people reach out to us saying, I did some genealogy work and I believe that my great grandfather was interred there. And we always love to talk to the person, but we cannot confirm that we have in our assemblage that particular set of remains. So down the line, if we could do genetics and try to link those, that would be wonderful. Right now, the way funding is and the price of doing genetics on 500 sets of skeletal remains is really nearly impossible. Okay. So we kind of have to sample it and see where we go from there. As far as repatriation is concerned, because these were really what the law considered kind of unclaimed remains, we were able to save them, to study them with the agreement that we then rebury them in the burial ground, which is now in West Philadelphia, where they were supposed to have been moved in 1859. So that was a really important part of this project, was making sure we put everything back in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, it seems like what sort of, I guess it's quite sad in a way, but like a lot of what you've mentioned and the issues and the challenges that you're facing around development, around the sort of destruction of heritage, around conflict and contestation around heritage, these are issues we have here as well. We know, the three of us being involved at Canteen Copy, where illegal mining at one stage was taking place. It's still under contestation at the moment. In Cape Town, there's been burial grounds also excavated through developments. Prestwich Place is probably the most famous one. And this seems to be a global issue that as archaeologists, we always, at some point now in our careers, end up getting entangled with this conflict that gets generated through heritage and development and job creation and different histories and overlapping pasts. Um, it's probably a very big question, but I mean, how do we engage with these issues? How do we tackle them in meaningful ways? Because it seems to be very global. It seems to be all over the place.
Well, certainly, I agree with you 100%. It is a global issue. And, one of the issues are modern ideologies versus ancient ideologies. So, for example, if you have an ongoing war zone, like where the Islamic State or ISIS is, actively destroying ancient relics like Palmyra, in Syria, in Iraq, some of these sites are destroyed purposefully, and some of them indirectly, being in war zones, they are then subject to looting and illegal antiquities trade and things like that. Yeah, I don't. I wish I had a better answer for you, and
That's a tough one, yeah.
I don't think that archaeologists, what they can do is get involved in active promotion for the preservation of heritage, but a lot of times legislation and the ability to actually protect things in a lot of regions of the world is very loose. And until that changes, I think we're going to continue to hear these stories throughout our lifetime as it goes forward. But I guess focusing on education and using some of the heritage as a point of bringing people together versus driving people apart is kind of what I do and try to do in my own work. Whether or not it works on a global scale, it's tough. It's very tough.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that we have as well is even with preservation of heritage. Sorry, he wants to be part of the conversation.
All the cinematic effects that we're adding in here.
Yeah. Even with the preservation of heritage, even that in itself has sort of abrasive points to it. Is whose value systems are you prioritizing? Which system of preservation do we approach? Should we be preserving things? For example, here with rock art, chipping rock art and using paint is an important part of muti among certain people. So now suddenly you come in and then you now you disassociating people with their heritage because of the way that we approach it. So it is very, and of course there's issue around job creation. Should we be looking after heritage sites and then sacrificing who knows how many jobs? It's a big mess. It's a very difficult thing to untangle.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's almost as if each situation is unique. It's going to be different. Like canteen copy, for example, where there's obviously been quite a big discussion, Tim, as you said, around job creation, economic development in an area or part of the Northern Cape where there isn't that much happening. So these kind of opportunities that do present themselves, people want to grab them with both hands, essentially. But I think we're coming up on time now. Mike, you were going to add something there, and I think we'll wrap up.
No, I mean, these are the conversations that we need to continue to have. We need to have these conversations about heritage preservation, but we also, as archaeologists, need to listen. I think, one of the things that we've all acknowledged many times is that we often, in the course of a significant amount of education, we start to get pigeonholed in our own beliefs and understandings of things. And there are belief systems and understandings of heritage that are beyond the bounds of rigid, stringent PhD, kind of understandings. And so it's important for us not only to speak up for the science and speak up for the heritage, but to also listen to the public and really be willing to absorb that information.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, thanks so much, Mark. I think we'll call it there. Thanks for the very interesting chat and stuff. And I'm glad we got some time to sit down with you. I know you're going to be busy in about the next month from now, so I'm glad we scheduled this interview before things get a bit crazy your side. But yeah, thanks again, and I'm sure we'll schedule something again sometime soon. Maybe we can schedule another session where we can talk about maybe some of your research and stuff, and
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
something along that line as well.
That sounds great, guys.